All right, welcome everyone. This is, of course, Greg Ferris with MyoBrain. This will likely be on our YouTube channel, but mainly making this for our clients, specifically those in the online training arm that we have. But even if you're a nutrition-only client, you'll get some valuable things out of this. Also, if you're just a random bystander digesting our content, should get some cool stuff out of this. Obviously, if you're interested, look into us for online coaching. All right. So the goal of this presentation is to give clients understanding of this relationship between stimulus, which is like what you're doing from workouts, recovery, which is what it sounds like, all the things you do to recover from that training, and then ultimately your adaptation, which is what you're trying to get stronger, faster, improved, marker for health, whatever. And just that relationship between those three things and how we think of this when building out programs from each individual. So like many things within physiology, it's quite simple, but a lot of things go into the simplicity, which is the purpose of the presentation. All right, so let's define this a little bit more. The stimulus is like what I kind of mentioned here. This would be the training volume for a specific action. So how many miles someone's running in a week, how many sets of legs someone does in a week, how many hours of low intensity cardio someone do in a week. All of these are examples of sort of an objective way you can measure stimulus or work. Recovery is what you think of, all the things that come into how you will actually determine the response of that stimulus. So how much are you sleeping? How much are you eating? How much you're recovering in between workouts, right? Do you work out 8 hours in one day, or do you work out 2 hours, 4 days a week? All those variables will come into how you recover from the work. And then ultimately, again, adaptation is really the goal. It's the improvement of fitness, of strength, or a health marker, muscle mass, VO2 max, resting heart rate, et cetera, et cetera. So those would be how we would define each of those variables. And ultimately, why is it important to be looking at these three things? What's the relationship, right? So understanding these three variables, again, allows us to set an initial stimulus here and then adjust it over time with the individual. Without understanding these three components, you're kind of just guessing, right? So the more we can understand these things, the more we can individualize a program and have someone progress and adapt over time. So this really here, hopefully this graphic, shares some light on the goal between the relationship we're trying to find between stimulus, the work you're doing, your ability to recover from that stimulus, and then ultimately how that would drive up the adaptation or the goal. Again, build muscle, improve your running speed, whatever. So if we have this matched within reason, again, your work to recovery ratio within a given time, let's say an 8-week training block, what should occur here? Your ability, your adaptation should increase over time. You're at minimal risk for overuse injuries because, again, you're able to recover. Think of this as capturing all of the work you do in a week. You're able to capture all of that. There's no sort of wasted junk volume, if you will. Few workout blocks are also wasted. You're not having to waste entire months and months and months of training of not doing enough or doing too much. Then also it becomes time efficient. This is important too, especially if you're not aiming to be a high level athlete, right? Your stimulus will also be dictated upon how much time you have in a day, in a week. For most people, they can't just recover more, train more, recover more, train more, and then just adapt more. They're going to be somewhat capped on, this is how much I can sleep, this is how much I can think about exercise, this is how much I can think about warming up, etc. So of course, this relationship, when you know someone's ability to recover, it makes sure they can be time efficient with their goals, okay? Now, let's look at two different examples here of what we obviously don't want. So this would be a low stimulus to adaptation level. So if you are not training enough or with enough intensity, the right movements, whatever, this is your ability and this is what you're giving yourself, and your recovery is obviously super high, which is great. you're not really doing enough to drive an improvement in adaptation, right? Now, this isn't always a bad thing. This may actually be a goal, say on a week or two long vacation or the holidays. And as we'll talk about later, we're also going to look at like one specific goal of like a back squat. But in reality, if you're doing back squats and bench press and running, all of those individual things has its own lane it's running on. So for example, if you really want to improve your running at a certain period of time, you may need your back squat to go into a low stimulus to recovery relationship to make room for the running, right? So it's not that this is always bad, but you can't analyze this and say, hey, simply, this person is not doing enough work to get better at that skill, right? At a certain point, if they want to improve that skill, we have to increase the stimulus in some manner, all right? Of course, doing this unintentionally, as put here, this can lead to spinning your wheels. As you can imagine also, is that you could have a program that is built with an adequate level of stimulus to recovery for you to improve. And let's say you're supposed to train 5 days a week for 4 weeks in a month. So 20 sessions in a month. My math was tough there. Let's say you miss 5 workouts in a month. Well, just by missing the workouts, right? Maybe your stimulus was too low. So it's not basically your programming was bad on paper, but just the execution, the adherence drove you into this state, all right? And then, of course, you can see where we're going here. The opposite of that problem would be the stimulus is simply too high. Now, outside of maybe some really wacky places, I don't think your stimulus could be so high in a given movement that you still wouldn't adapt on some level. So it's not like the strength wouldn't increase, your speed wouldn't increase or whatever, but the downsides here would be you're at a much higher likelihood of overuse injuries. So think patella tendon, shoulder, low back, etc. You're also at a very increased likelihood of mental burnout. So if you don't get hurt or mildly injured, just your vigor to train, your excitement, you may be more lethargic and other things outside of the gym. You're also being quite time inefficient, even if these two things aren't improving. Again, outside of hyper competitive athletes, you have to think to yourself, is doing 50% more work to get 5% better based upon where I am with my ability level really worth it? So for example, if you can do 6 sets of squats per week and put on 10 pounds on your squats each cycle, would you take that, or do you want to do 20 sets of squats a week just to put on 5 more pounds in a cycle? For some people, the answer is yes. For other people, it's like, I'll just be more patient, right? You kind of want to match that relationship. And then the final thing I'd think about here, this does put a heavy stress on recovery being perfectly locked in. So the higher and higher stimulus goes, we see here that it's unmatched by quite a bit. But visualize it being like right here, like it's just over recovery, or maybe you can get away with it. Maybe it's a little bit too much sometimes. You get the idea. But the second you have a couple of bad nights sleep, inadequate calories, relationship stress, there's almost no room for error there, right? So that also can be just a risk of the stimulus being too high for someone's current adaptation level. All right, so a quick review here. So as you can guess, right? So you don't improve, you don't get stronger, whatever, by the high stimulus alone. You really improve as much as you can adapt to, right? This really is the, once you're training enough, right? This is the thing that's really going to drive that adaptation. Are we recovering enough to the stimulus, right? And of course, we know with working with people over a decade now, that recoverability, as I mentioned, is not fixed. Things like poor sleep, inadequate calories, poor exercise technique, things can get sloppy. If we're not riding it, poor programming can get in the way. The classic thing I see with this, like, is in CrossFit. People do pull-ups like a couple times a month. They'll do like kipping pull-ups like 20, 30 in a workout. And then May will come along and they'll go do Murph and they'll do 100 kipping pull-ups and they're just wrecked for an entire week or two because they were not, the programming was not properly preparing them for that task. So now for a long time, their ability to recover is going to be much, much lower, right? This also can happen even if you're writing your own programming. Say if you're combining running, again, with weight training, and you go have really hard 400-meter repeats on Monday, you try to back squat on Tuesday, you probably can do those things, but maybe not within that 24-hour window. So now, again, your ability to recover from that leg training day is going to be hindered, right? Your performance will be hindered based upon how you're strategizing the overall week, right? And our goal when we write programs for people, of course, is to find that adequate stimulus to recovery ratio, assess over time, and then be dynamic as we need to with the person. This really is the goal of one-on-one programming with someone. So again, recap here. This is our goal, to get within reason of stimulus to recovery. And then, as you'd imagine, let's say you're doing this for January, February, March, April. Notice here in the far right, your adaptation, your performance ability is going to increase. So over time, if these stay fixed and you become better in some capacity, you guessed it, you're going to need to do more in some capacity to improve, right? Now, this does not just happen like that. This takes a lot of time to see that. It's not like it will happen in 8 weeks for most people, but eventually it's going to happen. If you've met someone, for example, who went from running a 7-minute mile, 6-minute, and then 5:30 and 5 and 4:45, it's highly unlikely they're doing the same exact thing they were doing when they first started running. And you could take that for any skill, right? And of course, if you look at what they did day 1 versus day 10,000, it looks drastically different. But there may be a whole bunch of little steps in between there, right? And that's how you kind of assess things cycle to cycle, really, with our clients, all right? So these would be really variables that could also indicate why someone's not progressing outside of just, hey, should we increase their stimulus, okay? So of course we have volume. This would be the easiest way to quantify stimulus, but we also have intensity. This is why we're so keen on clients recording themselves so we can objectively say, hey, I know you said that was an RPE 9, but you really had more in the tank. And we just need to push ourselves a bit more, right? Training log. This isn't a problem for our clients, but if you're just going to the gym and just doing stuff and not writing it down, a huge part of your results likely can just be more awareness of how much weight you're lifting, how fast you're running, whatever it is. So keeping a training log and being more intentional session to session will be a variable that you can adjust. Recovery, we've talked about that. Body health, I would break this up from recovery because you can be recovered, like have good energy, good nutrition, or whatever. But if you have, say, a growing strain that's not allowing you to express your strength on a deadlift or a squat, it's not necessarily like you need to be doing more. You need to be fixing that actual pain or injury, right? Which not always going to be, again, overlapping with recovery there. So as I mentioned, you want to make sure you're checking all other boxes before just considering doing more volume. So of course, that could be the answer. If it is the answer, we likely would, again, gradually increase volume to just that desired stimulus, which we'll talk about again. But most people with recreational goals, I'll put this very, very bluntly, don't need this dramatic increase in volume at several points in their life. You really probably need a handful of these if you're recreationally, between like super beginner, advanced beginner, intermediate, then like high level intermediate. Maybe you could be competitive if you wanted to. You don't have that itch, right? So it's not like, again, this will be something that you go through every 4 to 6 weeks. This will be more than likely something you analyze like semi-annually if you really need to be increasing your volume to improve. And the last thing I'll say on this desired stimulus piece is that, of course, we'll look at one real world example here of back squatting. But in reality, you're going to have several of these, lanes going at one time, where you may run an 8-week cycle where you're squatting and benching and doing pull-ups, doing CrossFit, whatever. And it may be that 6 out of the 8 things you're wanting to get better at are improving. Those don't need to be touched. But these 2 things over here, you know what? My calves need more work. Okay, let's add some more calf volume, right? So it's usually not always people need to do more of everything, because really unlikely, unless you're super advanced, you train for months and months and months and nothing gets better. So you really have to be analyzing each kind of section of your goals and say, okay, cool, these areas are doing great, these are lagging, let's look to address these particular movements or goals I have, all right? So if we're a bit lost, hopefully we're not, this real world example, I think kind of can bring home of how you would actualize this. All right. So say we have our guy named Bryce here. He's 28 years old. He's trying to get stronger legs and build his bigger legs and stronger legs, right? Let's say he currently back squats 185 for 6. We don't know how big Bryce is. Let's say he's 200 pounds. This would be like a pretty high level beginner as far as leg strength goes. So we initially give him, just an example here, 5 sets of back squats per week. We would call this kind of specific training for that goal. We also would give him 10 sets of a week of accessory work. So non-specific, but should have some carryover, obviously, to hypertrophy and leg strength. His program just for legs may look something like this, all right? Now, what we would do is have him run a program similar to this, and maybe more complicated, whatever, and do this for 4, 6, 8 weeks, and then post-test and see, did Bryce get stronger based upon this amount of work, the stimulus? And of course, if we're coaching him one-on-one, we'd be able to understand his body weight, recovery variables, motivation, travel, all of those things. So in a real-world example, this is pretty much what it looks like. We evaluate progress, again, a post-test. Let's say he improves. Let's say Bryce goes from 185 for 6. He does that cycle. He hits 195 for 6. Bam. Maybe we change a few variables, but overall, we don't need to reinvent his overall stimulus, which would be this, to be honest. In order for him to get stronger, we probably would stick with a very similar plan as far as squatting goes. Maybe other things need work, but this looks like it's adapting quite well. So going back up here, it's pretty simple. If the client improves, no changes to volume, look at other things, change some things based upon preference or whatever, but you're good to go. Do that again. See if you can get 205 and 215 and etc. Okay. Now let's say the client doesn't improve. So let's go down here and let's say he goes 185 for 6 and then he post-test and he goes 195, but only hits it for 4. All right. So then we would analyze, okay, evaluate recovery, training intensity and intentionality. Were they adherent to the plan, etc.? Body health to deal with sort of any aches and pains, etc. Now, of course, if any of these fail, and of course, we would also be looking at these over time with the individual, but really think like, hey, I think I could get stronger if I was more adherent, or I had better sleep, or I had better nutrition. The goal should be to do those things first, not drastically add volume, and then follow the arrow back up here, and then evaluate progress again, say 4, 6, 8 weeks. Not to mention too, sometimes you just have a bad day, right? But I'm kind of looking at this through the lens of you're seeing this program, you're seeing this person go through week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. You're kind of seeing they're not getting stronger. For most people, by the time they hit a post-test, they kind of know what's going to happen for the most part. But I digress there. But let's say, again, he is checking all these boxes here. That may be the case. He needs to gradually do a bit more in order to improve. And to be blunt, if this was Bryce here coming to us in January 2024, this is not going to happen in March, right? Unless we really made a mistake somewhere. This will probably happen somewhere like late 2024, where he needs a real, again, reset of all of these things, assuming his recovery is good. So again, do not think of this as something to be done like every 8 weeks. You have to do 2 more sets of something, right? It really is more long-term focus. But like I said, if you look at someone, if this is Bryce in 2024, and then Bryce is doing 285 in 2025, 2026, it's unlikely this will be his program, right? If he puts 100 pounds on his squat, it's unlikely he'll do the same thing as he was doing, you know, when he was squatting 185. But it would be, again, gradual over time. Maybe an extra set here, some extra accessory work here and there, right? Maybe 5 or 10% more work when he does hit a plateau. Okay. So now for the full review, some recap here. Number 1, the goal of a program we set out, or if you're doing this yourself, is to think about always matching your stimulus to recovery variables and then be dynamic over time. This could mean as you become better, you need more work. This can mean your recovery comes down due to work, due to having a kid, due to travel, whatever. Your stimulus should come down, whatever, right? But be dynamic with that. Recoverability, as we've mentioned, is not fixed. That can go up or down. This will also be specific to each movement, okay? So if you're running and squatting and bench pressing, you may find out that you're just going to have better luck to adapt to some things, and you may need to put more intentionality on something else to improve. For me, I squatted like 400 plus pounds doing 6 to 8 squats a week. Not that much compared to what other people do to be significantly less strong than I am. The opposite of that, it took me benching like 4 days a week, or probably close to like 15 to 20 sets of bench press, probably 3x the work to bench like 275. And there are plenty of people that do a lot less work than I did to bench press a lot more than me, right? So you will have some things you just adapt to naturally more and less. Performance tests are the best way to really gauge this, right? You can look week over week, but I really do like for people to actually do AMRAPs, to do 5RMs, to do things like that to say, hey, are you actually better? Is your adaptation objectively, the same, better, or worse than it was before the cycle? As I mentioned before, again, most trainees at the beginner to intermediate level will get a lot more out of improving these recovery variables, all of this, than they will just doing more. Most people are leaving a lot on the table with recording themselves, knowing how hard they train, taking good notes of their training. For example, your body angle, your breathing, how it felt, how long you rested, just being really, really detail oriented with training, making sure you're eating enough, sleeping enough, not on TikTok till 2 a.m., etc. Right? It's kind of in a good mood to train each day. So again, for a lot of people, their simplest way to improve is not going to be doing more stimulus. It's going to be like their stimulus is here, and they need to make sure their recovery can match that. Right. And then finally here, if and when, again, the stimulus does need to be increased, which you're doing things correctly over years and years and years, it likely will, unless you've just become pretty content with your results, which is not a bad thing. It should be done gradually, right? You don't go, like when I mentioned, I did 20 sets of bench press a week at some point. I did not go from 3 sets to 20. I went from like probably 5 when I started to then like 8 to then like 12 to then like 16 to then like 20 over like 4 or 5 years, right? I was pretty much just going through this evaluation. Am I doing enough to adapt, right? Am I here? Okay, I'm not adapting to my current level of training. I'm not feeling beat up. I feel like I can do more. So I was here, right? Maybe I would get stronger, right? My adaptation level, were following me, would pick up. So I would have to do more over time. I spent some time here for sure, where I would maybe try to bench 20 sets a week too early. I would have some shoulder fatigue, couldn't have good kind of good pop with the exercise, so I have to back off. Maybe I would do a little bit less to get here again to improve. That's what I mean. It's dynamic over time. But again, as you progress and as you get stronger, as you get faster, these are all the variables to think about. So for the 8 people who are still here, 26 minutes in, hopefully this gives some good insight on just some X's and O's of exercise science and programming and all the things that are going on in my head when I'm writing cycles for people and helping people progress with their goals. All right. So that's all I have. Any more questions, comments, let me know, and have a great day. Thank you.